We have met the enemy, and it is us. Good morning. I'd like to...
You can do mine again from your perspective.
Yeah, my original idea was actually to cede my time back to Louise anyway. Let me just explain for a second while they're getting me together what it is that I do. I do innovation at the Department of Education. I think about it in three ways. One is accelerating the things getting into the field that are critical solutions to problems that we know we have. Second is put out a lot of regulations. We spend a lot of money. That means we create incentives in the marketplace, whether we mean to or not. How do you get those incentives aligned with the right activity? And then the third thing is about the ecosystem. And this is part of what I mean by the ecosystem. So I want to talk today about how we actually move the conversation around open educational resources, because a lot of my role, as I said, this third piece is about how do you create the context for innovation to happen in a very different way, in a way that actually allows it to have impact in the field. That's about systems and structures and policies and regulations, but it's also about context. It's about the conversations that people are having. And that's where I want to start today, because it's very interesting to me as a person who has spent time in business and in technology and before coming into education, how we describe the value proposition of open educational resources, and then what that means for how people approach it in the marketplace. And this is going to stun some of you, so I'm glad you can't ask me any questions, but I think it's time to shift the dialogue. Many of you have already started to do this, but we have to move past free. Like, free is always going to be an important part of the value proposition, but the reality is that we are in a world where we know that we are going to have basically zero-priced content. Demand and supply will continue to work. This demand is going to be limited. They're only connected in any way you describe it, whether you're talking about people who can afford books or people who are connected online. There's hours spent on school in this specific context or hours in the day. It provides a tremendous amount of growth right now, but it is ultimately finite. Supply, on the other hand, is unlimited. Digital content is going to all content digital. We now have a huge public subsidy going into, and always have, frankly, into creating more content that will be online. We have every person with the potential to be a publisher, many who believe they're actually good at it, which I'll come to. And then the reality is that the pressure in the marketplace is that the vast majority of the supply side, most content is free. Most business models are free. And when you take the rest of the world into context, the reality is that free is going to be what they can afford first. So the largest market opportunity, the people who are going to set the conditions for how new educational content and resources make it to the rest of the world that's not being served, they're going to touch the free content first. Supply and demand will work. Second, it's an important part of changing the dialogue for us to acknowledge that SOER is actually the still dominant type of content available. It's not just open in every context. Let's talk about it. The prevailing practice is left unchanged. We still are working with ill-defined competencies and standards. Most scope and sequences start with a single hypothesized static learning progression or none. Limited content and approaches. So most people, when they put together, whether it's an open system or a closed system, especially though the closed systems, start out with a learning progression and then they attach specific content to it. They don't think about how you branch off of it, how you actually create multiple pathways, different approaches, different modalities for the different types of students, different contexts that students will be operating in. And the how. Most of the content out there has little opportunity for feedback. It doesn't have much adaptive capability for personalization. It's largely untested, whether it's the content itself, the instructional approach, or the assessment. And it's usually under-informed, if not completely uninformed, by the learning sciences. Now, I know in this room, none of that is true. But we have to remember that the balance of the content that is out there falls, if not prey to all of this, to big portions of it. So how do we get around this? And I put this up as more and better open educational resources about creating effective educational resources. It is about creating a learning community. People who raised your hands and said, who did not raise your hands when you were asked, do you know what design thinking is? When you heard Louise speak, that is design thinking. She has created a community and leveraged the process to go after a very specific set of problems and design solutions iteratively that actually work, don't work, and are redeveloped very quickly into comprehensive solutions changing outcomes. Like, I didn't say that succinctly, but that is design thinking. So, how people learn. There's a tremendous body of knowledge out there about how people learn that most people who create content don't know anything about. How to. Identify and describe what is to be learned. The common practices, you get maybe some folks who are expert in the field, maybe some good teachers in the room. If you have some technology, you use that. If you don't, you use Post-its, and you figure out what the scope and sequence and learning progression ought to look like. And that is the basis for not only how you and your school might set out a curriculum, but how textbooks get started. Like these $50 million projects we keep hearing about, it's still the basic same process. We know how to do it better than that. We know about cognitive task analysis. We know how you figure out what experts really know. We know how to do dynamic sequencing. We know how to use big data to figure out the learning progressions in an empirical form today that we haven't before. The different methodologies of assessing and allowing people to demonstrate mastery of a given topic area. I'm not talking about massive at the macro level of assessment. I'm talking about the micro level. When we get to the subtask level, what is the best way to figure out if someone has really mastered something? And how do we actually get that knowledge into everyday practice that people are doing as they develop content? Design and implement experiences which enable mastery of what is to be learned. Worked hard to come up with words without saying instruct, right? But what are the different ways that we can approach teaching people these different concepts, the knowledge, the skills? How is it designed, and then how do you distinguish that from the different delivery methods? How does it change when you're delivering it online versus in person? These are all things that we actually have a significant amount of knowledge about today that doesn't make it into how we actually design most of the content. Whether it's closed or open, whether it's free or not. And in my contestation today is that what will distinguish content in the future is its ability to demonstrate its effectiveness, and it will most likely demonstrate effectiveness if it starts to build from what we already know works. Maximizing motivation and engagement. Cuts across everything that I just named. We know, in fact, that the reality is that we know a lot about how to get students engaged. Not only if we don't know it in this sector, we know it in other sectors. We have yet to figure out how to actually apply it. But there are people today developing very specific models using well-validated engagement models to test the level of engagement that are then producing content and approaches and instructional platforms that use that kind of science to make sure students stay motivated throughout the work. And then best-in-class examples. Where do people go to find where these things have actually happened? Why doesn't everybody in America talk about your work of the Open Learning Initiative at Carnegie Mellon, the work of whoever it might be, Louise Waters? Why isn't it online and easy for people to access to see how that system worked to transform? Imagine if the learnings that Louise was able to get across her 3 campuses were multiplied by the learnings across everyone in this room. And we had a mechanism by which we captured the learning, synthesized it, and diffused it much more quickly. What would that learning ecosystem look like, and why doesn't it exist today? We need to provide better tools. We need to reduce the barriers to quality. Data and interoperability standards. We talked about this for a long period of time. I know there's a lot of concern about consolidating them too quickly, but the reality is that we know that until we actually get to a place where we can share information more easily, more readily, and connect systems, we are going to continue to reinvent the wheel over and over and over again, sub-optimizing the limited resources that we have. Open libraries, whether it's the competency models that I talked about, or empirically designed and refined learning progressions, recognizing there will be multiple learning progressions. People can start with better hypotheses because we have so much data about where students have been successful, what the real learning progressions look like. Open systems. We need validation and testing modules so that you can figure out quickly whether the content that you have created is actually working or is not working. And test it across large user bases with A/B testing so you really can figure out what's working quickly. And though Flex is one example of an authoring and a netting system, we need many more that allow us to draw open and closed content together, string them together around these learning progressions as we're figuring them out, and figure out how we actually make it easier for good people to do great work by putting the tools in their hands. And then finally, open data. The registries. Steve will talk about more, I'm sure. And also recommendation engines. Like the algorithms around figuring out what content is next, what content is best for this student at what time, in what context. Those are complex things. Not everybody has to try and figure that out, and in fact, not everybody can. So how do we get engines that are open, that people can keep working on? And just like the Netflix challenge, you keep having people have contests to figure out how you make it one step better. And then finally, open data. One of the best things that happens with having our resources available and online is the data that comes off of the use. Constant interaction, student and teacher, figuring out what's working and what's not. The more data we can pull together with the power that we have to do big data analysis, the more we can figure out. Frankly, we're now at the point where we don't have to have really strong hypotheses. We can let the data get crunched and find the patterns that we would never think of, the unintuitive ones. So the question then is, how do we create the feds a better context for these things to happen? All the work that I just talked about, you guys have to do that. For us, there are a few things that we can do. One is we can make performance matter. The question that Ralph just talked about how do we move from a world where you have to have the credential to a world where if you demonstrate effective, you actually get the credit for it. That's an important switch. It's an important switch across the entire educational spectrum. And we've talked a lot about it in public, about the application of it to people. We haven't talked about it as much around programs and products. That, I think, is about to change because we'll have the capability to do it. Until then, people should have to demonstrate that they know what they're doing before people make large purchases. The good news about free is that it makes it easy for people to adopt and innovate. But when people are spending millions of dollars, they should have to demonstrate something. Ease and inform access and procurement. Everyone here knows how hard it is, even when your stuff is free, to get it into a school or school system. I don't care what country you're from. And the reality is that it's mostly difficult because people don't know what they're doing when they're trying to choose. A lot of the people in the room in these selection committees don't have the backgrounds to evaluate whether something is effective or not. And frankly, they're not presented with the information to tell them whether it was or not either. So how do we begin to shift the frame so that the right people are in the right room, making the right decisions on the right information that we provided to them, and that it's a lot easier for the good stuff to make it through? The shared infrastructure and utilities, we can invest in that. The learning registry, that is going to be an important part of the context. But there'll be many, many other things that are important, whether it's government funded, whether it's philanthropy funded, whether the private sector decides that it's important for them to jump in and create some platforms because they think they're new business models. I think all of these things are going to happen, and the more we can figure out how we leverage those to the benefit of the entire field, the more quickly the field will evolve, the sooner we'll get to broad impact. We heard about the regulatory barriers. Let me name two that are high on my list that are related to this performance thing. Seat time. So I know we hear a lot of conversation about people wanting to do more with less and making college affordable and accessible and things like that. And I think that the work that we're going to do around open educational resources is going to help a lot of people. But let's just take credit hour at Pick Your College. If I can demonstrate competence in that area, why should I have to sit there? And why should I have to pay full price? I'm just saying. And And then I'll leave that one alone. You know, I figured out that I'm past, I've just had my 2-year anniversary at the Department of Education, so I'm actually, believe this or not, I have passed the average shelf life of a political appointee, so I feel very free. And I'm supposed to stop, so this one that's really obvious is we can reward sharing and advancing the field, kind of like Hewlett's doing today, but we haven't done a good job of that at the federal level. We need to figure out how we create those incentives to get you to make it worth your while to share. Thank you.